Hey, what's going on, everybody? Doing a little tutorial for you guys leading up to the art battle coming up on August 3rd. So I thought I'd choose Tokyo Ghoul anime to do a quick little tutorial for you guys. So just kind of jumping into things. Right now what I'm doing is just a wash of the background. So for a basic wash, if you guys are not familiar with using watercolors, it's just basically using a lot of watercolor on the background. You'd probably want to use like a large flat brush, plenty of water. Don't be afraid to really push into the watercolor paper. And I would highly recommend that you get watercolor paper because it doesn't let the paper break down with all the water being used. It does kind of kind of roll up on you just a little bit depending on how much water you use. And so what I'm doing right now is just applying three different colors that I thought would be a great background for the piece. So as you kind of finish up with the wash, depending on how you're going to do your foreground or background, I wanted the wash to be the background, and then I was going to use a heavier palette, heavier colors to do the foreground piece, which is going to be the portrait. And so what I'm doing is just sketching it out. Whenever you guys are sketching, I know traditionally if you guys are just starting out, you're probably comfortable just laying the paper down flat on a table. But I kind of shy away from that. The only reason I would suggest to do it this way, upright vertically on an easel with your arm stretched out and your pencil kind of holding it like a brush, is because you tend to get a better perspective on what you're drawing, and your lines are a lot smoother. You have better control. You can see that my wrist is not bent. My whole arm is straight. I'm controlling the lines with my shoulder and my elbow, not with my wrist. And so the piece tends to go a little bit faster, a little bit smoother when you guys kind of stretch your arm out a little bit, sit down straight up instead of hunched over. If you guys noticed, if you've been drawing a lot on a table with your body hunched over, you probably got some back pains afterwards. Your eyes are probably tired because you've been focusing so hard. So I'd recommend doing it this way. It's probably a little uncomfortable to try it out at first, but I'd recommend just giving it a shot, because you guys are probably going to find that your back is going to be a little bit more what do you want to call it? I don't know. You can work with it a little bit better. You're not going to be tired at the very middle of your watercolor piece. And so I would recommend trying it this way. You're definitely going to have a little bit more mobility. You're not going to be tired. So give it a shot. Right now what I'm doing is just doing a basic sketch of the portrait that I'm going to be doing, Tokyo Ghoul. And I'm about done with the piece. I was just kind of doing some of the details in the hair. I chose a really easy portrait. That way I could have a lot of fun with framing in the face with hair, and using, of course, really bright colors to start doing the portrait. And there's kind of a very wide range of color on the body, so there isn't a lot of details there. So I chose that because it's going to give me a little bit more freedom, and I don't really have to worry too much about the details. So right about now I am applying the watercolor. Originally in the painting or in the reference photo it's a lot of black, but I didn't want to use black because I think it was too stark. So I went with phthalo blue, and I am using a watercolor to do all the actual painting in this. Using kind of a very small brush to get in there in the little details, because it's kind of it's a smaller size. I would say this is kind of like a 12 by 16 sheet of watercolor paper. So what I'm doing is just going in there and just painting in the dark areas that normally would have been black. I don't really worry about the details at first. I want to kind of build up my self-esteem as I'm painting. So I tend not to go for the details at the beginning, because I think that's kind of counterintuitive to the creative process. So that's just kind of how I paint. I tend to go for some of the bigger brush areas, or at least for the areas that don't require so much detail. And so I've kind of switched to a bigger brush here because I'm doing the body, which is in the actual reference photo is just completely black. But for here, I wanted to add a little bit more vibrancy to the colors. Again, I'm using phthalo blue to do kind of the shoulder area. And as I kind of work around whatever areas were going to be black, I'm just using phthalo blue And here in a minute, I'm going to switch the color up on the body just to kind of give it a little bit of variation. So basically what I'm doing is just going in and getting in the details and making sure that I got enough saturation on my brush. Make sure you guys are always going back to your paint to really saturate your brush. Try not to push the paint around too much when you're on the surface, because it can kind of rough up your paintbrush and kind of rough up the surface as well. You don't want that. You definitely want a smooth surface. So I went ahead and switched to a warmer color. The reason I chose red was because it blends into blue really well. If you guys know that your color palette, you know that's going to create purple, and it really blends in well. It's not going to be a a muddy color or anything like that. So if I would have chose orange, of course, I would have got brown. But, red just tends to mix really well on this palette. So I went ahead and chose that color. And I'm going ahead and just darkening some of the other areas in the painting. And that way, like I said, it's easier just to kind of get some of the darker areas out of the way, some of the shadows. When you're doing portrait work, depending on the light source that's on your portrait, you want to focus on the shadows first, just because it creates a little bit more depth and some contrast whenever you're adding the highlights. But for this particular piece, there's a lot of dark areas on here, so that made it really easy to make those types of decisions. So whenever you're going in and choosing a reference photo, pay attention to what the composition is of the photo. I definitely would say to challenge yourself, but if you're just starting out, try not to go for a painting that you think is going to be completely out of your range. Try to pick something that's going to be fun, that's going to be easy, that you can really be creative with and add your own little touch. And then as you get a little bit more accustomed to the difficulty level and, some of the skill sets you're building, pick some harder ones, that are going to challenge you. This one I just wanted to do for fun, just as a demo. I didn't want to get into too many details. I just, like I said, wanted to give you guys a little bit of a demo and instructional for you guys to do your own watercolor drawings on your own. Right now what I'm doing is adding some white to the hair. At first I thought maybe I could do it with a acrylic pen, but I could tell that it was a little bit too rough on the surface. So there are no rules to painting, guys. So if you want to switch to acrylic on a watercolor piece, because it's got a little bit more saturation, a little bit more depth in the paint itself, you can do that. So what I did is I switched to acrylic paint for the white, because it saturates so much better on here. And you can really, really see the white, and it covers up a lot of the background that was underneath. So I went ahead and just did that because it just made my life so much easier. And that's what this kind of whole process is about, is don't make your life harder than it has to be when you're painting. If you can cheat, you know what I mean? I know a lot of artists that use shortcuts, and it just cuts down on time. This piece actually took me only an hour to do. So I sped up the process here in the video so you guys can see. But it took me about 58 minutes total to do the wash and the sketch and all the painting and just doing all the little detail work. So again, this is all about the process. Set yourself up to have fun and to make it easier on yourself. Right now what I'm doing is just filling in some of the teeth and the details there. Of course, that takes a little bit more control of the brush. So you can see I'm kind of leaning in a little bit because I got to see those details with my own eyes. I can't see it from far away, guys. I'm getting old, so unfortunately that's going to happen. Time to get some glasses. Anyway, getting back to the piece, I'm still working in some of the gum line. I have some tools that I use for watercolors. I don't use just a brush and watercolor paint. If you go to Michael's or Hobby Lobby, they have special watercolor markers that work just like a pen, but it's watercolor and a marker. So I use that sometimes when I'm doing detail work, so that works really well. I also use watercolor crayons and watercolor pencils, and those help a lot whenever I'm on the go and I just want to do a quick little piece. Those are easily packed away in my little book bag. So highly recommend you guys stock up on some different types of tools that you can use. Like I said, the watercolor pencils, watercolor crayons. Make sure you have a brush, however, that's really going to be important. So you can get that stuff at Michael's and Hobby Lobby. So I use those just to kind of make my life a little bit easier. Right now what I'm doing is throwing in some blood splatter that's in the reference photo and adding that in just here and there wherever I see it in the actual photograph that I'm referencing. I'm just throwing that in there with a brush, and I'm using acrylic paint because it's just, like I said, the saturation, you can see it a little bit better. If you used watercolor, it would fade with the water, like all watercolor does. So unless you're going to be using heavy amounts of watercolor, it's just sometimes easier to just get acrylic paint and just put it on there. Not a big deal. And right now I'm doing some of the highlights there again in the reference photo. I'm using a tiny brush there and just getting some white watercolor paint. Actually, no, that's white acrylic paint, sorry. Because it's going to stay there. It's not going to fade as much. So I'm just going in there, adding some of the detail work. I usually leave the details at the very end. That's another little tidbit for you guys that are starting out. Don't do the details at the beginning. Build up your painting so you can work on the details at the very end. You want to build it up like a house, right? You want the foundation to be there. It doesn't have to be, well, with a house, you definitely want a strong, accurate foundation. But when you're painting, it doesn't have to be so accurate. You don't have to agonize so much over at the very beginning of the piece. You want to have fun with it and have a good time while you're painting. And right now what I'm doing is just some drips for the body, just because I think it's going to give it a little bit of abstract flair to it. That red is kind of bloody, which kind of goes along with the theme of Tokyo Ghoul. And so that was really fun. And at the very end, I'm just adding some line work to the hair, just to make sure it stands out a little bit more. Maybe it's a little bit more rigid. So I just want to add that in there at the very end. And I'm just using a Sharpie marker. For all the black areas, I use the actual Sharpie. Like I said, there's no rules to painting, so you guys can just have fun with it. And don't be afraid to try different things. Nobody says it has to be 100% watercolor. A lot of artists switch different mediums on their pieces. So that's it, guys. Time to sign it. And if you guys have any questions, comments. So otherwise, thanks for watching.